It's kind of like if you've ever gone to a museum and looked at a classic painting as a young person, let's say Picasso's Guernica, right? You might say, oh, it's very dramatic. I like the imagery. I like the composition. Later in life, when you get older, maybe a little more mature, and you understand something about the background and the agony and the history and the warfare that it represents, your appreciation for the painting deepens.
Right.
Not because the painting has changed, but you've lived life more.
Yes. Yeah.
It was like that with me for the Bhagavad Gita. It's been my literary companion, you might say, for the past 50 some odd years.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Without These Books. I'm your host, Allison Roach. Without These Books is a thank you inspired video podcast that celebrates the authors, books, and characters that changed us as writers, readers, and as people. So, today on our show, I will be talking to Joshua M. Greene. He is a popular lecturer on Holocaust history and an author of many biographies which have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. He is a former instructor at Hofstra and Fordham Universities. He's also the recipient of numerous awards for his books and films. He currently sits on the board of Yale University's Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, and he has served as the director for strategic planning for the United Nations Summit of Religious and Spiritual Leaders. He is the author, most recently, of the forthcoming Unstoppable, Siggi B. Wilzig's Astonishing Journey from Auschwitz Survivor to Wall Street Legend. All right, so what is the book that you chose to talk about today?
I chose the ancient Sanskrit text Bhagavad Gita.
So why was this the choice?
Well, when I was a young man, I met a group of yogis and meditators when I was in college at the Sorbonne in Paris. And they were studying the Bhagavad Gita. At the time, George Harrison was from the Beatles, was one of the people studying with them. And I got to do a little recording of Indian devotional music at Apple Studios. So that was kind of an incentive to stick with the Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
The other reason was that the Gita, which is in the form of a dialogue, features the hero Arjuna, who is a warrior. And Arjuna is facing what we might have called an identity crisis. And that pretty much defined the whole generation back in the late 60s. And so for me, the Bhagavad Gita has been an evolving relationship. Initially, it was grasping the basic ideas of the Gita, that we're not the body, that we're eternal souls, that we transmigrate from one lifetime to another, that the universe operates according to certain cosmic principles that we can actually understand, and that there are other universes that we can visit. That was very exciting. And as I got older, I realized this isn't just about some fabulous other creation. This is very practical stuff. It's kind of like if you've ever gone to a museum and looked at a classic painting as a young person, let's say Picasso's Guernica, right? You might say, oh, it's very dramatic. I like the imagery. I like the composition. Later in life, when you get older, maybe a little more mature, and you understand something about the background and the agony and the history and the warfare that it represents, your appreciation for the painting deepens.
Right.
Not because the painting has changed, but you've lived life more.
Yes. Yeah.
It was like that with me for the Bhagavad Gita. It's been my literary companion, you might say, for the past 50 some odd years. Some of those years have been very odd, come to think of it. But in any case, yes, it's been very important because it's been a lens through which I've been able to filter all the experiences, all the relationships of my life as part of a journey toward a deeper understanding of myself.
And does it affect the way that you understand others?
One of the most critically important dimensions of wisdom teachings, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita or any of the other great wisdom texts of world history, is that it inculcates a vision of other beings, humans and other than human forms of life, as divine sparks of God. And if you come to recognize that is the same spark of divinity in you as in others, that can change the way you relate with others. It can stimulate greater compassion. It can stimulate greater patience, greater understanding, greater love. Why should I love you? Well, it's a nice sentiment. But if I see you as of the same spiritual nature as me, we might say part of the same spiritual family, then there's a deeper compulsion for me to express that love. So it's very dramatically affected my relationships with others. It's helped me to understand people who might otherwise be the object of my bitterness or even hatred.
Right.
And that, of course, connects very much with my academic field, which is Holocaust studies.
Right. So tell me a bit about that and how this text has influenced your work there, or how you approach things there.
For many years, people would come up to me when I would be lecturing at state bar associations or university courses on World War II or European history. And somehow they knew that I was a practicing yogi. So they would say, how do you reconcile your spiritual view of creation with what happened in Europe, the agony and the tragedy of 75, 80 years ago? I didn't have a very good answer for the longest time. So I went deeper into the testimony of Holocaust survivors, people who had been through the Holocaust, mostly on video. There are recordings of people describing their experiences in their own words that go back to the 1970s. In particular, I'm privileged to be on the board of advisors to the Forthcoming Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University. And listening to the experiences of those who were there began to reveal for me certain parallels. First of all, Holocaust testimony is about the return of traumatic memory. Now, curiously, in yoga philosophy, the subject is the return of suppressed traumatic memory. Now, if we're going to get a little pedantic about this, it's the non-material self, the conscious self, coming into the material world and assuming material bodies. And there's a suppression of our knowledge of ourselves as transcendent beings. And now we're identifying with the traumas of our lifetime. The Bhagavad Gita says those traumas are not who you are. You have those experiences, but they don't define you. And much of Holocaust testimony is this very, very careful balance of going back and forth between what French Holocaust scholar Charlotte Delbo described as everyday memory and mémoire profonde, deep memory. So that was one very important connection for me between Bhagavad Gita and my studies and research in Holocaust testimony. And there are others as well. One question people always ask me is, how do you live with this knowledge of what people can do to each other? Of course, that's one of the grand questions of history.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
With a shorter answer. The short answer is when we turn away from our true nature, from that beautiful core self that's there in everyone, we can fall very, very far. And in our bitterness, in our anger, in our fear, become capable of horrible things that today we might say, I could never be a part of that. Well, World War II proved otherwise.
Right.
But when we turn to that core self, that deeper self, we can soar very, very high.
Absolutely. So you say that this this text is always sort of, you're evolving, your understanding of it is evolving as you evolve. How often do you return to it?
About every day.
Every day, yeah.
Sure. It's the Bhagavad Gita is only 800 verses, 4-line verses. It's not
Mhm.
particularly long, but the Sanskrit language is packed with meaning. So one word can mean a dozen different things. The word Atma, for example, can mean soul, senses, the body, humanity,
Mhm.
our better nature. It can have many different meanings.
Right.
So coming at these verses, depending on what's happening in your life, you'll
Yeah.
find deeper and deeper meaning.
Yeah, you can draw so many different things from it. That's really beautiful. Um, so about your book that is being released, I'm so excited. I've read some of it so far and I've really enjoyed it. It's really a tremendous story. How did you come upon it?
It kind of came upon me, really. I had done maybe a dozen biographies of Holocaust survivors, and I really thought I was done. It's such a dark period of history.
Mhm.
Then one day, about 8 years ago, the phone rang, and a voice at the other end of the phone said, "You know, Mr. Greene, I've read some of your books. I think you should write my father's biography." So I asked him to tell me about his father. After a while, I realized it was a Holocaust survivor, and I said, "I'm sorry, I'm not doing that anymore. I don't want the darkness. I only want the light."
Hmm.
And the person on the other end of the phone, who turned out to be Siggi Wilzig's son,
Mhm.
said, "You don't understand. My father was more than a light. He was a beacon of hope for every immigrant who ever came to America." And he went on and on. I did some research and I found out that he wasn't exaggerating. Siggi Wilzig, who passed away in 2003, came to America with nothing. A short fellow, 5'5.5", no money, only a grade school education, after having survived the worst imaginable forced labor and tortures and selections for death and death marches. And he was only 88 pounds when he was liberated by the American army. They
Wow.
came here, and by the time he was done, he had built a business empire in oil and banking with assets of more than $4 billion. And the more I got to know him, the more I fell in love, to be quite candid, I guess,
Mhm.
with someone who embodied such joy for life.
Mhm.
I I can't tell. Siggy was the kind of person who would get up in a restaurant and start singing and dancing in the middle of the aisle, just like an entertainer instead of this important bank president.
Right.
And people would ask his family around the table, "Does he own the restaurant?" They say, "No, he just loves his life." Having gone through what he went through, to be such a life lover, I thought that was a story worth telling.
Absolutely. And we can all take inspiration from that. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Join the conversation at withoutbooks.com.